Now, we're going to jump over here to Judges. And when we start Judges, we're going to pick up kind of a new theme. Moses was kind of the big guy in the Old Testament. Moses then is followed by Joshua, his understudy. Joshua, would you say Joshua rises to Moses' level? They were compared in a lot of ways, but Joshua is kind of down a little bit. And now the period of Judges, is going to be a period of fragmentation and chaos in Israel, where you've got all these little judges kind of doing their thing. And so basically the major theme of the book of Judges is going to be everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. Well, that's one of the major themes. Everyone does that which is right in their own eyes. And the book of Judges is a transition book. The book of Judges is a transition. There was no king in Israel. And so the book of Judges moves from Joshua saying basically a 200-year period or thereabouts, saying basically there's going to be a movement to a king. To a king. Now, who is actual king during the period of Judges? God is king. God is king during the period of Judges. These judges all administer under God and go to victory in various ways. God raises up these judges, but God is largely the king. And Israel's going to move then to actually a human king, as Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 17, as Moses predicted that they would have a human king. Now, meet the judge. Moses set up the institutions in the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 16 through 18, thereabouts. He set up the institutions of Israel. And one of the institutions was this judgeship. And the judge was basically to do two things. One, he was to distribute justice. He was to distribute justice in the land. Who particularly needs justice? Do the poor, the fatherless, and the widow, do they need justice? And so the judge was to take the side of the fatherless and widow and to give justice, to make equity, things fair, so that even the widow and the orphan could get justice. And the judge was not to take a bribe. Money and justice were to be separated. It was not to be, money and justice were not, no bribes. Judge was not to take bribes. So Moses sets up this thing. But when you read the book of Judges, were any of the judges sitting around doing court cases? No. So what Moses describes kind of misses what the book of Judges does. Most of the judges are out doing what? Actually, the judges are more what? Military deliverers. And so in the book of Judges, Samson, what? Samson doesn't sit around doing court cases. He's out beating up on Philistines. Okay? And so basically they're military deliverers leading Israel to war. And Judges chapter 2, verse 16 describes this. Let me just read this. Then the Lord raised up judges, and what did the judges do? Who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. So the role of the judge was a deliverer, a kind of a, quote, savior, to save Israel from the hands of these oppressors. And so they really take on this role of this military deliverer. And here's another way to look at it, as almost a tribal or regional chieftain. And this is important to realize. When you read the book of Judges, you can't just go from one judge to the next judge. They're not necessarily in chronological order. And they overlap the regional areas, okay? They're regional chieftains. And so therefore, Samson may be going off at the same time as Jephthah. Jephthah's over here in Jordan, Samson's over here. And so the two judges, they judge in different regions. And so the judges may overlap each other because they're all in different regions with each other. And so they're basically petty chieftains or tribal chieftains kind of thing. And they'll rule for like 40 years, they'll rule for 80 years, they'll rule for 20 years, and things like that. And they'll rule kind of thing as a petty chieftain, like there. Now, each generation participates in this. There's an interesting conflict between, and I want to bring this up, between Joshua and the book of Judges. At the end of the book of Joshua 21, if you look at verse 43 here, it's interesting what Joshua says. Joshua is reflecting back. It says, and this is Joshua 21, 43 to 45, it says, "So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their forefathers." Is this statement true? The Lord gave Israel all the land he swore to give to their forefathers, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their forefathers. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. Is that true? Joshua says, we took, all the land was taken. Question, were the Philistines still in the land after Joshua? Samson fights Philistines. What about the city of Jebus, the city of Jerusalem? Was the city of Jerusalem owned by the Jebusites after Joshua? Yeah, they took it, but the Jebusites had it right back, apparently. And during the time, who actually takes the city of Jerusalem? David takes it. This is like, hundreds of years later, David takes the city of Jerusalem. The Jebusites had it. So can Joshua say we took all the land like that? Well, actually, if you go over to the book of Judges, Judges presents another vision. Judges chapter 119. You just turn over 3 or 4 pages. Judges 1:19 says this. The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had iron chariots. Now, what's the problem with iron chariots? When it says iron chariots, what goes off in your head? You just see Ben-Hur and the gladiators with these iron chariots, tromping down people in this big, huge iron chariot. Do you realize in Israel they burned their chariots? Question, what were the chariots made out of if you're going to burn the chariots? They're made out of wood, okay? So the chariots, when it says iron chariots, don't think Ben-Hur, okay, with the huge chariot and stuff. Think instead wood-made chariots with iron reinforcement in certain places, okay? So they would have like an iron shield in the front and reinforced with iron in certain places. But it wasn't a massive iron, chariot that you would see like with a Ben-Hur kind of movie or something, okay? So they're wood chariots reinforced with iron. And by the way, where do chariots work well? Do chariots work well in the plains? Do chariots work well in mountains? No. You're going to hit rocks and you're going to blow a tire. Yeah, right. You know what I'm saying? You're in the mountains and you hit rocks, you're going to go over in your chariot and stuff. So they work well in the plains. So Israel couldn't take the plains because they couldn't do the... So question, Joshua says, we took it all. Judges says, well, wait, we didn't take the plains because they had iron chariots. Okay? So do you see the conflict there? So you say, well, what's one's right? Okay, it continues. And let me finish this out just with Joshua. How can Joshua say that we took all the land, all the Lord's promises were filled and things? You have to read things in their context. Joshua, at the end of his life, is reflecting. At the end of his life, he's reflecting. Did Joshua do everything that the Lord commanded him to do? And did God bless Joshua beyond his imagination? Yes, and Joshua is reflecting at the end of his life. And by the way, when an old guy reflects at the end of his life, does he look back and see all the good things that the Lord has done to him? Now, does that mean, when he says all, does that mean every little detail? No, he's just saying basically the Lord gave us all this stuff. We were successful in taking the land. And he's making these global statements and things like that. But is he reflecting back on a whole life? You know what I'm saying? Is he an old person reflecting on their life and they look back and they see it in a certain way? Okay? Is it okay for an old person to do that? To reflect on life and see it in a whole cloth rather than all the little details? Yes, it's okay to do that, okay? So what I'm saying is Joshua's saying, I finished my life. I finished what God called me to do. We took all the land. God gave us all his promises. Everything was fulfilled. And Joshua's just reveling in God's goodness to him. Then what happens? After Joshua, do things change? Yeah, because there's still these little pockets of resistance in the land, and then the book of Judges has to face those pockets of resistance. It's just a different way of looking at things. You know what I'm saying? Don't be careful about taking a scripture passage and universalizing it and absolutizing it, okay? You don't want to absolutize or universalize a lot of this stuff. Joshua's just reflecting. He's making comments in a grandiose kind of way. And it's okay to do that. It's okay to do that. So, all right, now the conditionality of the covenant. Judges chapter 2, verse 20 says this. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel because Israel had violated the covenant. The Sinaitic covenant that God made with him at Sinai, the covenant, the blessings and cursings, and all the 10 commandments and all the commandments God had given. Israel had violated the covenant that I had laid down to their forefathers and has not listened to me. Then God says, therefore, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel. So in other words, there were still some groups inside of Israel. God says, I will no longer drive them out because they violated my covenant. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. So now the inhabitants of the land who are left, God uses them to test Israel to see whether they'll follow him or not. And so now what happens? You also get this transition between generations. Does each generation have to know God? Does each generation have to come to know God? And what happens is, can you have slippage in the knowledge of God between generations? Can you have slippage in the knowing of God between generations? Does your generation know God the same way my generation did? Does my generation know God the same way my parents' generation did? Does each generation kind of have to come to their way of knowing God? And is there slippage between the generation? I see it between my parents' generation and my generation. And I think I see it in your generation as well. Judges chapter 2, verse 10 says this, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers. What is this gathered to your fathers thing? Okay? Now let me just describe this, okay? In their culture, when they bury a person, they basically put them on a bench, okay? The benches are about this long. They're in a cave, okay? They're in a cave. Usually the hole is about this big, so you have to bend down, and they slide the person on a bench. And he's wrapped up with all sorts of linen with spices and kind of like a pizza. Anyways, they put him in there, and then he's in there, okay? What happens after a period of time is the person melts down, like, the flesh decomposes and stuff, and then the bones are left. After a certain period of time, just the bones are left. And then what they do is I'm sorry for being this so morbid, but this phrase, gathered to your fathers, they then gather up the bones of the person, and underneath the bench, there's a hole underneath the bench. And what they do is they take the person's bones and they put the person's bones in the hole underneath. And that's when you're gathered to your fathers, because where are your fathers? Your fathers are in the hole. They were there before you, and they were put down there. And now you're gathered to your fathers and I'm not making this stuff up. This is the truth. Okay? And so then they slide the next person in, and then they, wait, and then they gather them to their fathers. Okay? Does that make sense? Or just in how they do that? They don't, like we do, put somebody in the ground like that and do it that way. Yeah. Hannah?
Because are really close together. Do they go on top of each other?
Yeah, actually their bones get mixed up. When they gather them to their fathers, the bones are all mixed up. I've seen some of these things, and they're all mixed up.
Yeah, but like if two people at the same time and you put them both in the bench.
Oh, okay, yeah. Now they have multiple, these coke tombs, they may have 8 or 10 different of these nooks that go in like that, and so there's room. I mean, and if there's not room too, sometimes they'll chip them out. But, so there's more than one bench. And so then, multiple people. And anyways, they did it. But anyways, sorry, but let's get off that. But the other thing God says then, so they're gathered to their fathers. Let me go back to this chapter 2, verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Okay? In other words, they don't remember the crossing of the Red Sea. They didn't see that. They don't remember the taking of the land. They didn't see that. So this new generation grows up. They've never seen what God has done for these people. And God points this out and stuff. Then down to chapter 3, verse 1, it says, these are the nations the Lord left to test all the Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare. He did this to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not previously had battle experience. So part of the reason why he leaves them in the land is, does every generation need to learn how to defend themselves in war? And so he says partially the reason that leaving them in there is so that they also learn how to go to battle, to defend themselves. And God says that, so he leaves them in that land for that purpose, okay?